This was the Breitspurbahn, Hitler's extraordinary railway dream that never left the drawing board.
Imagine a railway so enormous. Its tracks were nearly 10 feet wide. And imagine a train designed to carry thousands of passengers across a continent.
The plans called for luxury on a scale rarely imagined for a railway. Swimming pools, cinemas, restaurants, and enormous passenger accommodation.
Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a 1942 megaproject ordered by Adolf Hitler, one that literally blinded its creators to the laws of physics. We're talking about the Breitspurbahn, which translates to broad gauge railway. But honestly, it was so impossibly massive that it almost completely defies belief.
It really forces us to ask a big question. What actually happens when absolute power tries to defy the very laws of physics? Because this project, it wasn't just about building a bigger, faster train. It was a terrifying attempt to command the unbreakable rules of motion through sheer dictatorial will. They were prioritizing a monument of ego, completely over-engineering reality. Section 1. A monument on rails, dealing with the post-World War I railway crisis. So we're starting right after World War I. The German railway, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, totally locked the funds for any sort of expansion because of severe post-war reparations. By the time the Nazi regime took power and artificially stimulated the economy, the country was staring down a massive rail capacity crisis. They desperately needed a logical transport solution. But what they got instead was a megalomaniacal fantasy. Enter the Breitspurbahn. It was envisioned as a super broad-gauge railway network. Hitler essentially imagined a future German empire that was strictly land-based, and he wanted a massive railway to act as the equivalent of the British Empire's fleet of ocean liners. The ultimate goal? To completely dominate a conquered continent. We're talking about connecting a future world capital in Berlin to the agricultural breadbaskets of Ukraine, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, and eventually pushing as far east as India. Moving to Section 2, the 3,000-millimeter order, where they flat-out defied railway experts. To make this sprawling empire a reality, an absolute, non-negotiable order was given in the summer of 1942. And let me tell you, this threw the Transport Ministry into a complete panic. Hitler grew super impatient with standard railway diagrams and just issued a blunt command. He completely ignored the advice of seasoned railway experts who clearly saw the disaster of building a network entirely incompatible with the rest of Europe. To really grasp the sheer absurdity of the scale here, the standard Stephenson gauge, which is used across most of the world today, is 1,435 millimeters. Hitler, well, he demanded a Breitspurbahn gauge of 3,000 millimeters. That is literally more than double. We are talking about a track so incredibly wide that a person could stand dead center between the rails and look up at a canyon of steel. It would be wider than the wingspan of a light aircraft. Crazy, right? Section 3. Palaces of steel, looking at the monstrous rolling stock. Now, this impossible track width obviously dictated the staggering size of the proposed trains. You can't exactly just plop a normal train onto a 3-meter-wide track. No, every single dimension had to be massively scaled up to match the dictatorial ambition. The blueprints called for double-decker carriages that were just staggering. Looking at the measurements, these things were going to be 42 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 7 meters high. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's taller than most suburban houses. When linked together, they would form a 500-meter-long moving skyscraper. And it was designed to barrel across the landscape at 200 kilometers per hour, carrying up to 4,000 passengers. It's like a small town on wheels. And inside, it was an absolute onslaught of opulence. The whole point was to completely seal high-ranking officials off from the conquered lands they were traveling through. The designs featured amenities you'd expect to find on a luxury cruise ship: 196-seat cinemas, marble bathing salons with running hot water, velvet passenger lounges, and even indoor promenade decks. But highlighting the grim wartime reality, these moving palaces would also be protected by heavily armed baggage cars sporting 20-millimeter anti-aircraft guns. Section 4. The physics of failure, or how reality fights back. Because beneath all that gold leaf and the crystal chandeliers, the engineers buried in their technical drawings realized a terrifying truth. The laws of physics are not so easily bullied, not even by absolute power. So, the absolutely crucial point boils down to this number: 100 tons. Every single individual carriage, fully loaded with its massive dimensions, the marble baths, and all those luxury amenities, would weigh at least 100 tons. And as any physicist will tell you, huge mass moving at high speeds completely changes the math of rail travel. At those planned speeds of 200 kilometers per hour, the incredible mass of the train generated an outward push of 56,000 newtons of lateral force on the curves. Let that sink in. That is a sideways shove strong enough to completely shatter the steel wheels and literally tear traditional wooden tracks right out of the earth. The physics simply didn't work. Which brings us to Section 5, desperate engineering workarounds and engineering delusions. Since they were completely unable to tell the dictator his dream was mathematically impossible, which, would have been unthinkable, probably fatal, at the time, the engineers proposed a series of increasingly desperate, surreal workarounds just to delay the inevitable reality. To handle that massive lateral force, they first had to widen the track curves to a ridiculous 5-mile radius. That's 8,000 meters. Next, they had to abandon traditional wooden ties entirely. Instead, they proposed an unbroken, continent-spanning concrete highway that would just swallow up rivers and forests, all just to support those massive axle loads. And finally, to actually move the thing, they proposed powering the trains with actual submarine engines and gas turbines borrowed from airships. It's just wild. This all resulted in a really bizarre bureaucratic game. 41 different locomotive designs were submitted by major industrial firms like Krupp and Cross-Maffei to try and solve these impossible power demands. Essentially, these companies competed to draw the most outlandish engines they could think of, burying the project in technical complexity and keeping it alive strictly on paper, mainly so they wouldn't actually ever have to build it. Section 6, the dark human cost, focusing on forced labor. This brings us to the very grim reality of what laying a massive concrete highway across Eastern Europe would actually require, because the fancy blueprints hid a truly horrifying truth. The historical sources are very, very clear on this point. Machines alone could never build this sprawling concrete slab across rivers and marshes. The regime fully 100% intended to rely on the horrific exploitation of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates to pour the concrete. Countless human lives were to be buried forever beneath the rails. That opulent facade of velvet lounges and ballrooms, it was simply a mask for a massive plundering operation. The true purpose of the Breitspurbahn was to serve as a high-capacity artery to rapidly drain grain, oil, and ore out of Ukraine and Russia to feed the Reich. Human suffering was meant to form the literal foundation of the track. Ultimately, though, reality intervened. By 1943, this entire fantasy violently collided with the reality of the war. As the Red Army stalled the German advance at Stalingrad, the massive amounts of steel that were meant for these rolling palaces had to be urgently redirected to tanks and the defense of the Reich. The project was quietly abandoned, and thankfully, not a single rail was ever actually laid. The Breitspurbahn remains a haunting reminder that ambition, unbound by reality or conscience, creates monuments only to failure. It leaves us to wonder, as we look at this final question, how different does history look when engineering serves people instead of power? Thanks so much for walking through this incredible piece of history with me today in this explainer. I'll catch you in the next one.
Thanks for watching Billionaire Blueprint. For more exciting videos, please subscribe to the channel and keep watching.